The mystery of the Spirit. You wake up with good intentions. Today will be different. You'll be patient with your co-worker who never stops talking. You'll resist the urge to scroll mindlessly through social media. You'll speak kindly to your spouse even when you're tired. You'll choose discipline over distraction. By 10 a.m., you've already failed. This cycle, the endless loop of intention and failure, resolution and relapse, is exhaustingly familiar to anyone who has tried to become a better person through sheer willpower. We know what we should do. We genuinely want to change, yet something within us seems to sabotage our best efforts. 2,000 years ago, the Apostle Paul wrote about this exact struggle to the churches in Galatia: "Walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." This phrase, found in Galatians chapter 5, has been quoted in countless sermons, printed on inspirational posters, and referenced in Bible studies around the world. But here's the problem. Most people have no idea what it actually means. What is the Spirit? What does it mean to walk by it? And why does Paul present this as the solution to the human condition of wanting to do good, but consistently doing otherwise? The hidden meaning behind living by the Spirit is far more radical, more practical, and more transformative than the sanitized interpretations we've settled for. It's not about trying harder to be good. It's not about following more rules or working up more religious feelings. It's about discovering an entirely different source of power for human transformation, one that doesn't originate from within ourselves at all. This isn't just ancient religious philosophy. This is a roadmap for becoming fully human, for experiencing freedom from destructive patterns, and for accessing a life characterized by what Paul calls love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. But to understand what Paul really meant, and to discover how revolutionary this teaching truly is, we need to dig beneath the surface of familiar religious language and uncover the hidden depths of living by the Spirit. What Paul really meant. To understand what living by the Spirit meant to Paul's original audience, we need to step into the world of first-century Galatia. This wasn't a peaceful theological discussion, this was a crisis. The Galatian churches were being torn apart by a controversy. After Paul had introduced them to the message of Jesus and they'd experienced profound spiritual transformation, a group of teachers arrived with a different message. These teachers insisted that to truly belong to God's people, Gentile believers needed to follow Jewish law, particularly circumcision and dietary restrictions. In their view, faith in Christ was necessary but insufficient. You also needed to keep the law. This might seem like an obscure ancient debate, but it cuts to the heart of human existence. How do we become acceptable? How do we overcome our flaws? What makes us truly good? The answer these teachers offered was essentially effort, discipline, and rule-keeping. Do the right things and you'll become the right kind of person. Follow the prescriptions and transformation will follow. Paul's response was volcanic. In Galatians, he argues that this approach doesn't just fail to produce transformation, it's actually enslaving. It traps people in cycles of performance, anxiety, and either pride when you succeed or shame when you fail. Enter Paul's alternative: walk by the Spirit. To understand this phrase, we need to recognize that Paul is drawing on two rich conceptual wells. First, there's the Greek philosophical tradition that distinguished between flesh, sarx, and spirit, pneuma. In Greek thought, the flesh represented base, earthly desires and limitations, while spirit represented higher, rational, or divine aspects of existence. But Paul doesn't simply adopt this framework, he transforms. Second, there's the Jewish concept of ruach, the Hebrew word for spirit, breath, or wind. In the creation account, God breathes ruach into Adam, and he becomes a living being. Throughout the Old Testament, God's ruach empowers prophets, gives wisdom to leaders, and sustains life itself. The Spirit isn't just an abstract concept, it's the very presence and power of God. What made Paul's teaching revolutionary was this: He claimed that this same Spirit of God that had been given temporarily to kings and prophets was now available to all believers permanently. The Spirit wasn't just a force to be studied or aspired to, it was an indwelling presence that had taken up residence within them. This was an astonishing claim in the ancient world. The divine wasn't distant, requiring complex rituals or perfect law-keeping to access. The Spirit of God was as close as their own breath, dwelling within them, available to guide, empower, and transform them from the inside out. When Paul told the Galatians to walk by the Spirit, he wasn't giving them another set of rules to follow. He was inviting them into a dynamic, moment-by-moment relationship with the living God, whose presence within them could accomplish what no amount of human effort ever could: genuine transformation of character. This wasn't about trying harder, it was about trusting deeper. And that distinction changes everything. It's not about moralism. Here's the first hidden meaning that changes everything. Living by the Spirit is the exact opposite of moralism. When most people hear walk by the Spirit, they instinctively translate it into a to-do list. Pray more, read the Bible more, resist temptation harder. Basically, be more spiritual through increased effort. This interpretation turns living by the Spirit into just another form of the law-keeping Paul was arguing against. But that completely misses the point. Moralism says, here are the standards, try harder to meet them, grit your teeth and force yourself to be good. This approach relies entirely on human willpower and generates a very specific kind of person, someone who is either proud because they think they're succeeding or ashamed because they know they're failing, but rarely genuinely transformed. Living by the Spirit is fundamentally different. It says you can't transform yourself, but there is a divine presence within you who can. Your job isn't to manufacture goodness, but to yield to the one who is goodness. Think of it this way. Imagine you're trying to move a massive boulder. The moralistic approach is to push harder, strain more, perhaps get help from others who will also push. Living by the Spirit is like discovering there's a lever embedded in the ground next to the boulder. You didn't put it there, you didn't create its mechanical advantage, but when you use it, the boulder moves with ease. The paradox of the spiritual life is what might be called effortless effort. Yes, there is cooperation required. You must choose to yield, to surrender, to position yourself to receive. But the actual power for transformation doesn't originate from your willpower. It flows from the Spirit's presence. Consider a practical example. Let's say you struggle with anger. The moralistic approach says, stop being angry, control your temper, count to 10, try harder, and maybe for a while you succeed in suppressing angry outbursts through sheer force of will. But the anger is still there, bubbling beneath the surface, expressed in passive-aggressive comments or stress-related health issues. Living by the Spirit takes a completely different approach. It begins with honest acknowledgement, I can't fix this myself. Then it involves inviting the Spirit into the anger. Show me what's beneath this, what fear, what hurt, what distorted belief is fueling this anger. The Spirit begins to reveal root issues, perhaps past wounds, perhaps a belief that you must defend yourself because no one else will. As the Spirit brings healing to these deeper places and reshapes your understanding of God's care for you, the anger itself begins to transform. You find yourself responding differently, not because you're trying harder, but because you're actually becoming different. This is why Paul presents living by the Spirit, not as an obligation, but as freedom. When you're operating from willpower alone, every moment requires exhausting vigilance. But when you're cooperating with the Spirit, transformation happens organically, almost surprisingly. You look back and realize I responded with patience in a situation that would have made me explode 6 months ago. I didn't manufacture that patience, it was just there. The hidden meaning here is profound. Spiritual growth isn't about self-improvement, it's about displacement. The more the Spirit fills and governs your inner life, the less room there is for destructive patterns. You're not becoming good by trying to be good. You're becoming good by becoming intimate with goodness itself. This isn't passive. You have a role, choosing moment by moment to listen, to yield, to align yourself with what the Spirit is doing. But the power source isn't you, and that makes all the difference between exhausting religious performance and genuine transformation. The Spirit as divine presence. The second hidden meaning centers on what, or rather who, the Spirit actually is. In much contemporary religious language, the Holy Spirit has been reduced to an impersonal force, like electricity or wind, something you can tap into, utilize, or harness. This is a catastrophic misunderstanding. The Spirit is the presence of God Himself dwelling within you. Let that sink in for a moment. According to Paul's teaching, if you are in Christ, you don't just have access to spiritual principles or religious truths. You have the actual living presence of the divine within you. The Spirit isn't a thing you use. The Spirit is a person you know. This connects to a rich vein of imagery from the Old Testament. In the Hebrew Scriptures, God's presence dwelt in the temple, first in the tabernacle in the wilderness, then in Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. The innermost room, the Holy of Holies, was where God's presence resided in a particular way. Access was severely restricted. Only the high priest could enter, and only once a year, on the Day of Atonement. The message was clear. God is holy, transcendent, set apart. Sinful humans cannot casually approach the divine presence. But then something extraordinary happened. When Jesus died, the Gospel accounts tell us that the temple curtain, the thick veil separating the Holy of Holies from the rest of the temple, tore from top to bottom. The symbolism is unmistakable. The barrier is removed. Access is granted. And Paul takes this even further. He tells the Corinthian church, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" The presence that once dwelt in a building made of stone now dwells in people. Each believer has become a temple, a dwelling place of God. This isn't metaphor or poetry. This is meant to be understood as literal reality. The God who created galaxies and spun atoms into existence has taken up residence within you through His Spirit. The implications are staggering. First, this means you are never alone. Even in your darkest moments, even when you feel completely isolated, the Spirit is present. Not distant, not detached, but intimately near, closer than your own breath. Second, this redefines your identity. You are not primarily defined by your achievements, your failures, your appearance, your bank account, or your social status. Your deepest identity is this: you are one in whom God dwells. You are sacred space. This is why Paul can say elsewhere that you are hidden with Christ in God. Your truest self is wrapped up in divine reality. Third, this means that transformation happens from the inside out. The Spirit doesn't improve you from external pressure, but transforms you from internal presence. It's like the difference between painting a wall to change its color and planting a seed that grows into something entirely new. One is cosmetic, the other is organic. When you understand living by the Spirit as living in conscious awareness of divine presence, everything changes. Prayer becomes less about sending messages to a distant deity and more about attending to the one who is already present. Temptation becomes less about willpower and more about recognition. Do I want this thing more than I want closeness with the Spirit within me? Guidance becomes less about decoding signs and more about listening to the one who speaks from within. The hidden meaning here is that spirituality isn't about human effort to reach up to God. It's about awakening to the God who has already reached down, or rather reached in to you. You don't achieve divine presence through discipline. You receive it, acknowledge it, and learn to live from it. This is why the Christian life begins with receiving, not achieving. You can't earn the Spirit's presence. You can only open your hands and receive what's being given. And once you understand that the Spirit of the living God dwells within you, the question shifts from, how do I become spiritual, to how do I live in alignment with the Spirit who is already present. That's a completely different and far more hopeful question. Reoriented desires. Here's practically significant hidden meaning. When Paul talks about the flesh, he's not talking about your body, he's talking about misaligned desires. This is crucial because Christianity has often been interpreted as anti-body, anti-pleasure, anti-physical existence. That's not what Paul means at all. When he contrasts flesh and spirit, he's not contrasting physical and spiritual, he's contrasting two orientations of the human heart. The flesh, in Paul's usage, represents the part of us that is curved in on itself, seeking security, identity, and satisfaction in created things rather than the Creator. It's the part of us that says, I will find life meaning and fulfillment through this job, this relationship, this achievement, this pleasure, this level of control. The flesh isn't inherently evil, it's simply misdirected, looking for ultimate things in penultimate places. Living by the Spirit means allowing God to reorient your desires at the deepest level. This is far more radical than behavior modification. It's not about forcing yourself to want different things. It's about discovering that the Spirit actually changes what you want. Consider addiction as an example. Addiction isn't primarily about a substance or behavior. It's about what that substance or behavior represents to the addicted person. It might represent escape from pain, a sense of control, connection, excitement, or relief from anxiety. The addictive substance or behavior is actually a misplaced attempt to satisfy legitimate desires. The moralistic approach to addiction says, just stop, exercise willpower, replace the bad habit with a good one, and sometimes that works for a while, but often the person ends up white-knuckling their way through life, constantly fighting cravings or simply replacing one addiction with another. Living by the Spirit goes deeper. The Spirit begins to address the underlying desires. As you experience the Spirit's presence, you start to find the comfort, security, excitement, or relief that you were seeking in the addiction, but now from a source that actually satisfies rather than enslaves. Over time, and it is a process, not an instant fix, the craving for the addictive substance or behavior diminishes. Not because you're suppressing it harder, but because you're being satisfied more fully. This principle applies far beyond addiction. Consider ambition. The flesh-driven person pursues success because they believe it will finally make them valuable, respected, and secure. So they drive themselves mercilessly, sacrifice relationships, and live with constant anxiety about whether they're doing enough. Even if they achieve outward success, the inner emptiness remains because success was never designed to fill that particular hole. The Spirit-led person can still be ambitious and can still work hard, but the motivation is fundamentally different. They know they're already valuable because they're loved by God. They know they're already secure because their identity is rooted in divine acceptance. Now work becomes an expression of calling rather than a desperate attempt to prove worth. The same activity, completely different in a posture, or consider pleasure. The flesh says, pleasure is the goal, maximize it. Don't let anything interfere with your comfort or enjoyment. This leads to a life organized around avoiding discomfort and pursuing gratification, which ironically often leads to less actual joy and more empty hedonism. The Spirit doesn't eliminate pleasure. The Spirit reframes it. Pleasure becomes a gift to be received with gratitude rather than an entitlement to be grasped. This opens the door to deeper enjoyment because you're not anxiously clinging to pleasures or devastated when they're absent. You can receive them fully when they're present and release them gracefully when they're not. The hidden meaning here is that living by the Spirit isn't about achieving perfect behavior while still battling the same old desires. It's about experiencing transformation of desire itself. The Spirit doesn't just help you resist temptation. The Spirit makes you into the kind of person who desires different things. This happens gradually and organically, like a tree slowly growing towards sunlight. As you orient yourself toward the Spirit, as you practice awareness of divine presence, as you allow the Spirit to speak into your fears and wounds and distorted beliefs, your heart begins to change. You find yourself less attracted to things that used to captivate you. You find yourself drawn toward things you used to find boring or irrelevant. This is freedom, not the freedom to do whatever you want, but the freedom to want what is truly good. The Spirit doesn't take away your freedom of choice. The Spirit heals your chooser. What this looks like today. So how does this actually work in 21st century life? What does living by the Spirit look like when you're stuck in traffic, overwhelmed at work, navigating difficult relationships, and constantly tempted by digital distractions? First, living by the Spirit requires developing awareness. You can't cooperate with the Spirit if you're unconscious of the Spirit's presence. This means building practices into your life that help you pay attention. This might include starting your day with even 5 minutes of silence, asking the Spirit to guide your day. It might mean pausing throughout the day to take a breath and remember, the Spirit is here with me right now. It might mean ending your day by reviewing it with the Spirit, noticing where you sensed divine leading and where you operated from flesh-driven impulses. These aren't legalistic requirements. They're practical ways to wake up to reality. The Spirit is already present. These practices just help you notice. Second, living by the Spirit means learning to hear. The Spirit communicates, not usually through audible voices or dramatic visions, but through impressions, convictions, scripture that suddenly comes alive with meaning, the wise counsel of other believers, and a sense of peace or unease about certain directions. Learning to recognize the Spirit's voice takes time and practice, like learning to distinguish one instrument in an orchestra or one voice in a crowded room. One key principle: the Spirit's voice always aligns with the character of God revealed in Scripture. If you sense a leading that contradicts love, grace, truth, or God's revealed character, it's not the Spirit speaking. The Spirit doesn't contradict himself. Third, living by the Spirit requires surrender. This is where many people get stuck. We want the Spirit's help, but we want to maintain ultimate control. We want God to bless our plans rather than surrendering to God's purposes. Surrender doesn't mean passivity, it means active yielding. It's saying to the Spirit, moment by moment, not my will but yours. I release my grip on this outcome, this relationship, this anxiety, this agenda. Consider a practical example. You're in a conversation that's becoming heated. You feel anger rising, defensive words forming. Living by the Spirit in this moment might look like this. You take a breath and inwardly acknowledge, Spirit, I'm about to say something harmful. I'm feeling threatened and I want to defend myself. Help me. In that micro moment of surrender, you create space for the Spirit to work. Perhaps you sense a calmer response forming. Perhaps you suddenly see the other person's pain beneath their harsh words. Perhaps you simply feel the impulse to pause rather than retaliate. This doesn't mean conflict disappears. It means you navigate it differently, with the Spirit's wisdom rather than flesh-driven reactivity. Or consider anxiety about finances. The flesh-driven response is either to obsess, trying to control every variable, or to despair, feeling overwhelmed and hopeless. Living by the Spirit means bringing the anxiety into the light. Spirit, I'm afraid. I feel out of control. What are you saying to me? As you sit with this, you might sense reassurance of God's care. You might remember past provision. You might receive clarity about a practical step to take. Or you might simply experience peace that defies circumstances, what Paul calls the peace that surpasses understanding. Fourth, living by the Spirit happens in community. This isn't an isolated, private spirituality. The Spirit works powerfully through other believers, their encouragement, their wisdom, their correction, their prayers. When you're blind to your own patterns, other Spirit-filled people can see what you can't. When you're discouraged, their faith can sustain you. When you're confused, their perspective can provide clarity. Practically, this means you need genuine relationships with other people who are also learning to live by the Spirit. Not superficial church acquaintance relationships, but authentic friendships where you can be honest about struggles and receptive to input. Finally, living by the Spirit means releasing outcomes. The flesh wants to control results, manipulate circumstances, and manage everyone else's perception of us. The Spirit invites us to faithful obedience and trust. You do what you sense the Spirit leading you to do, you respond with love in each moment, and you release the results to God. This is perhaps the hardest and most freeing aspect of Spirit-led living. You're no longer responsible for making everything work out. You're responsible for listening and obeying. That's it. The burden of results shifts from your shoulders to God's. Living by the Spirit in the modern world means cultivating awareness, learning to hear, practicing surrender, engaging in community, and releasing outcomes. It's not a formula. It's a relationship. It's not perfection. It's direction. And it transforms everything. Evidence of transformation. Paul gives a specific list of what living by the Spirit produces: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. He calls these the fruit of the Spirit, and that word choice is significant. Fruit is not manufactured, it's grown. You don't produce an apple through effort and technique. An apple tree produces apples naturally when it's healthy and properly nourished. Similarly, you don't manufacture these qualities through willpower. They emerge organically as the Spirit does His work in you. This is why Paul says fruit, singular, not fruits, plural. It's not a menu where you pick the virtues that appeal to you. It's a unified expression of the Spirit's character manifesting through your life. Where the Spirit is at work, all of these qualities will emerge over time, though they may develop at different rates. Consider love. This isn't romantic feeling or sentimental attachment. It's the settled commitment to seek another's good, regardless of how you feel or what it costs you. This kind of love doesn't come naturally to self-centered humans. It flows from the Spirit, who is love. Joy isn't mere happiness dependent on circumstances. It's a deep-rooted gladness that can coexist with sorrow, a confidence in God's goodness that persists even in suffering. The Spirit produces this because the Spirit connects you to realities bigger than your immediate situation. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, but wholeness, integration, the deep settledness of knowing you're held by God even when life is chaotic. This peace emerges as the Spirit assures you of God's care and sovereignty. Patience, the ability to endure difficulty, delay, or frustration without falling apart or lashing out, flows from the Spirit's work of dethroning your ego from the center of the universe. When you're not desperately demanding that everything go your way right now, you can wait gracefully. Kindness, goodness, and gentleness are different facets of the same reality, treating others with the tenderness, generosity, and goodness that God has shown you. These qualities are unnatural for self-protective humans. They emerge as the Spirit secures your identity and frees you from constant self-defense. Faithfulness, reliability, integrity, keeping your word, flows from being anchored in the God who is faithful. The Spirit produces people whose yes means yes and whose no means no because they're not driven by anxiety or manipulation. Self-control is perhaps the most counterintuitive item on the list because we usually think of self-control as something we exercise through willpower. But here it appears as fruit of the Spirit. True self-control isn't gritting your teeth and forcing yourself to behave. It's the natural moderation that emerges when you're satisfied in God and therefore not driven by compulsive need. The hidden meaning here is that you can assess whether you're genuinely living by the Spirit by looking at what's growing in your life, not by checking off spiritual activities or religious obligations, but by observing, am I becoming more loving, more patient, more joyful even in difficulties, more gentle with people, including myself? Here's the critical distinction between genuine Spirit-produced fruit and manufactured virtue. Genuine fruit is sustainable and authentic. Manufactured virtue is exhausting and fragile. If you're being patient through sheer willpower, you'll be exhausted by the end of the day and probably snap at someone. If patience is spirit-produced fruit, it has a different quality. You're genuinely not bothered the way you used to be. If you're forcing yourself to be kind, it will feel like performance and people will sense the inauthenticity. If kindness is spirit-grown fruit, it flows naturally and people experience it as genuine. This is why Paul presents the fruit of the Spirit in contrast to works of the flesh. Works are produced by human effort. Fruit grows through divine life. You can counterfeit works. You can't counterfeit fruit. Not convincingly, not sustainably. The invitation is to stop trying to manufacture these qualities and instead to position yourself where the Spirit can produce them in you. Spend time with Jesus. Attend to the Spirit's presence. Respond to the Spirit's promptings, and trust that fruit will come in its season. Living by the Spirit is not an esoteric doctrine reserved for super-spiritual people. It's the normal Christian life that Jesus and Paul envisioned for all believers. It's the answer to the frustration of knowing what's right, but lacking the power to do it consistently. It's the pathway to becoming fully human, fully alive, fully yourself. The hidden meanings we've explored reveal just how radical this teaching is. It's not about moral improvement through effort. It's not about abstract spiritual forces. It's not about suppressing desires through willpower. It's about the living God dwelling within you, transforming you from the inside out, reorienting your desires, and producing genuine character transformation that you could never manufacture yourself. This is an invitation to a fundamentally different way of being human. Not the exhausting way of constant striving to measure up, not the despairing way of giving up because change seems impossible, but a third way, the way of surrender to divine presence, cooperation with divine power, and trust in divine goodness. You don't have to achieve this. You can't achieve this. You can only receive it. Open your hands. Acknowledge your inability to transform yourself. Invite the Spirit to do what only the Spirit can do. And then pay attention, respond, and trust. The promise is that as you do, you'll gradually become someone you never could have made yourself become. The fruit will grow. The desires will shift. The character will transform. Not through your effort, but through the Spirit's work. This is the hidden meaning of living by the Spirit. It's not about becoming more religious, it's about becoming more alive. And that changes everything.
Most people pray with their minds filled with fear, doubt, and desperate need. They beg, plead, and repeat words, hoping God will hear their suffering. But Joel Goldsmith discovered something revolutionary that changes everything about how prayer actually works. Traditional prayer keeps you trapped in the very problem you're trying to escape. When you pray from lack, you're affirming lack. When you pray from fear, you're strengthening fear. This is why your prayers seem to bounce off the ceiling and return unanswered. You're actually reinforcing the very consciousness that created your problems in the first place. Joel understood this spiritual law that most religious teaching completely misses. The secret Joel revealed is this: effective prayer is not asking God for something. It's remembering what God already is. It's shifting from human pleading to spiritual knowing. This one understanding transforms your entire prayer experience in 60 seconds. Your breakthrough begins when you stop trying to get God to do something and start recognizing what God is already being. This is the foundation of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered and taught throughout his ministry. He proved that when you understand the true mechanics of prayer, demonstration becomes natural and consistent, rather than hit or miss, hoping that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work at all. Joel discovered that God doesn't respond to your words, emotions, or desperate needs. God responds to your consciousness, your inner state of being, your spiritual awareness. When you align with this truth, prayer becomes instantaneous and powerful. This isn't religious theory. This is spiritual science that Joel proved through decades of consistent healing work. Think of it this way: you don't have to convince electricity to flow through a properly wired circuit. You simply flip the switch and connect to what already exists. Prayer works the same way when you understand the spiritual mechanics Joel revealed. The power is always there. The question is whether your consciousness is receptive to it. The 60-second transformation happens when you shift from asking God to heal you, provide for you, or protect you, to recognizing that God's nature is already wholeness, abundance, and perfect love, expressing through you right now. This isn't positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is recognition of what is spiritually true in this moment. This is spiritual science based on understanding the true nature of God and your relationship to divine consciousness. Joel proved this principle worked consistently for thousands of students across 4 decades of teaching and healing ministry that documented remarkable transformations in health, relationships, and supply. Here's what happens in those crucial 60 seconds. Instead of listing your problems to God, you spend that minute remembering God's perfection. Instead of describing your lack, you acknowledge divine abundance. Instead of focusing on illness, you recognize spiritual wholeness. This complete reversal of approach changes everything about your prayer experience. Joel taught that God doesn't know your problems because God only knows perfection. When you align your consciousness with God's knowing instead of your human concerns, you create the connection that allows healing and demonstration to unfold naturally. You're not trying to inform God about your troubles. You're informing yourself about God's truth. The transformation isn't in getting God to change circumstances. The transformation is in changing your consciousness to match God's perspective. From that elevated awareness, your outer experience begins to reflect your inner spiritual truth. This is why some people experience immediate results while others see gradual improvement over time. This is why some prayers seem answered immediately while others never manifest. It's not about God's willingness to help. It's about your consciousness being receptive to what God is already giving in every moment. Joel discovered that God is always giving, but human consciousness often blocks the reception through fear and doubt. Joel's revolutionary approach eliminates the separation between you and God that traditional prayer creates. Instead of talking to God as if God were separate from you, you recognize God as the very consciousness you are expressing through. This understanding dissolves the sense of distance that makes prayer feel like shouting across an empty void. The 60-second method is simple. Breathe deeply, release all sense of personal need, and spend those moments acknowledging the divine presence that is already perfect, complete, and expressing as your true being right now. You're not trying to get something from God. You're recognizing what you already are in God. You're not trying to get God's attention. You're giving attention to God. You're not asking for God's love. You're recognizing that God's love is what you are. You're not requesting God's power. You're acknowledging God's power as your spiritual identity. This shift from separation to unity changes everything about your spiritual experience. This shift from separation to unity, from asking to knowing, from human will to divine being, is what creates the miraculous results that Joel demonstrated and taught for over 4 decades of spiritual healing ministry. His students documented thousands of healings using this exact approach to prayer and spiritual practice. Margaret came to Joel's classes completely skeptical after years of unanswered prayers for her chronic pain. She had tried every religious approach, begged God countless times, and felt abandoned by divine love. Joel taught her the 60-second method. She was desperate enough to try anything, even though she doubted it would work any better than her previous attempts. Instead of praying about her pain, Margaret spent 60 seconds acknowledging God as perfect life expressing through her. She didn't mention her condition. She simply recognized divine wholeness as her true spiritual identity, not as something she hoped to receive. This felt strange at first because it went against everything she'd been taught about prayer. The first week she noticed moments where pain seemed to fade during her 60-second awareness sessions. By the 3rd week, she experienced hours of complete relief. After 2 months of consistent practice, her chronic condition had completely disappeared. Her doctors couldn't explain the improvement based on any medical intervention. Margaret later said the transformation wasn't just physical healing. She discovered a completely different relationship with God based on unity rather than separation, knowing rather than hoping, being rather than asking for divine intervention. Her entire understanding of spirituality changed through this simple practice. Robert's business was failing, creditors were calling, and traditional prayers for financial help seemed useless. Joel showed him how his prayers were actually reinforcing his consciousness of lack by constantly affirming his business problems to God. Every time Robert prayed about his financial troubles, he was strengthening his awareness of limitation rather than abundance. Robert learned to spend 60 seconds acknowledging divine abundance as the substance of all true supply. He stopped telling God about his financial troubles and started recognizing God's inexhaustible provision as his spiritual inheritance. This felt counterintuitive because his bank account and bills seemed to contradict any sense of abundance. Within 3 weeks, unexpected opportunities began appearing. A former client offered him a major contract. A business contact recommended him for consulting work. New revenue streams opened that he never could have imagined or planned through human effort alone. The solutions came from directions he hadn't even considered possible. Robert realized that God's abundance was always available, but his consciousness of lack had been blocking his awareness of infinite supply. The 60-second method opened his spiritual receptivity to what was already present and waiting. His financial situation completely turned around within 6 months of consistent practice. Sarah struggled with depression and anxiety for years. Her prayers felt like shouting into an empty void. She attended Joel's healing meetings, desperate for relief from her mental and emotional suffering that seemed beyond her control. Traditional counseling and medication had provided only temporary relief from symptoms that kept returning stronger than before. Joel taught Sarah that God doesn't know depression because God is pure joy, perfect peace, and unconditional love. Her 60-second practice involved acknowledging these qualities as her true spiritual nature rather than asking God to remove her negative emotions. This approach felt completely different from her previous attempts to pray away her problems. Gradually, Sarah began experiencing moments of inexplicable peace during her practice sessions. The anxiety attacks became less frequent. The depression lifted like fog disappearing when sunlight breaks through the clouds that had obscured her spiritual truth. She discovered that her emotional problems weren't her true identity after all. Sarah discovered that her true identity was God's joy expressing through her. The emotional problems were simply clouds of false belief that dissolved when she consistently recognized her divine nature through Joel's revolutionary prayer method. Within a year, she was completely free from depression and anxiety without any medication or therapy. These transformation stories aren't unique or exceptional. Joel documented thousands of similar healings over his 40-year ministry. The 60-second method works because it aligns your consciousness with spiritual truth, rather than human problems. Students from around the world reported similar breakthroughs when they applied Joel's teachings consistently and with proper understanding. The key is consistency and understanding. You must shift from human pleading to spiritual recognition. You must move from separation consciousness to unity awareness. You must transition from asking God for things to acknowledging what God already is. This isn't a technique you use occasionally. It becomes your natural way of relating to divine presence. This isn't magic or wishful thinking. This is spiritual science based on understanding the true nature of prayer, consciousness, and your relationship with divine presence. Joel proved these principles work when properly understood and consistently applied. The results speak for themselves across decades of documented healings and demonstrations. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond the basic 60-second method, Joel taught complementary techniques that deepen your spiritual practice. The first is what he called practicing the presence. Throughout your day, take micro-moments to remember God's presence as your actual being. These brief acknowledgments build a foundation of spiritual awareness that supports your formal prayer periods. While walking, driving, or working, silently acknowledge divine love flowing through you. When facing challenges, pause briefly to recognize God's wisdom as your inner guidance. These small moments create a continuous thread of spiritual consciousness that weaves through your entire day, rather than limiting spiritual practice to specific prayer times. Joel discovered that maintaining spiritual awareness throughout daily activities creates a consciousness that is naturally receptive to divine healing and demonstration. You're not just practicing prayer for 60 seconds. You're living from spiritual consciousness continuously, This consistent awareness becomes the foundation for sustained transformation. This consistent awareness dissolves the separation between spiritual practice and regular life. Every moment becomes an opportunity to recognize God's presence and let that recognition transform your experience from the inside out. Your entire day becomes a prayer of recognition rather than just specific moments of formal spiritual practice. Another powerful complement to the 60-second method is what Joel called spiritual discernment. This involves learning to distinguish between thoughts that come from spiritual truth and thoughts that arise from human fear, doubt, or limitation. This skill becomes essential as you develop deeper spiritual sensitivity and awareness of the different qualities of thought. When negative thoughts appear, instead of fighting them or feeling guilty, you simply recognize them as suggestions that have no power over your spiritual identity. You don't give them attention or energy. You return to acknowledging your divine nature. This isn't suppression or denial. It's simply choosing which thoughts deserve your spiritual authority. Joel taught that you don't have to eliminate every negative thought to experience spiritual demonstration. You just have to stop giving spiritual authority to thoughts that contradict God's perfection expressing through you right now. The goal isn't perfect thinking, but proper discernment about which thoughts to follow and which to ignore. This discernment becomes easier with practice. You begin recognizing the difference between divine inspiration and human mental chatter. You learn to follow the guidance that comes from your spiritual consciousness rather than reactive emotional thinking. This skill protects your consciousness from being disturbed by every passing negative suggestion. The third complementary technique Joel taught is witnessing. This means observing your human experience from the perspective of your spiritual identity rather than being completely identified with personality, emotions, and circumstances. Witnessing creates healthy detachment that allows you to respond rather than react to life situations. When problems appear, you witness them as temporary appearances that have no power over your true being. When success comes, you witness it as divine expression rather than personal achievement. This witnessing dissolves the ego reactions that block spiritual receptivity and keeps you centered in spiritual truth regardless of changing circumstances. Joel emphasized that witnessing isn't detachment or indifference. It's seeing from God's perspective where everything is working together for good, because everything is an expression of divine love seeking to reveal itself through your experience. This perspective transforms how you interpret and respond to every situation. This witnessing consciousness naturally develops as you consistently practice the 60-second method. You begin living from spiritual awareness rather than being tossed around by every changing circumstance that appears in your human experience. You maintain your center in divine peace regardless of external conditions. These three techniques work together to create what Joel called a transparency for God. You become so aligned with spiritual consciousness that divine love, wisdom, and power flow through you naturally without human interference or ego manipulation. This is the goal of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered and demonstrated throughout his ministry. The 60-second method establishes the foundation. Practicing the presence throughout your day maintains spiritual awareness. Discernment helps you follow divine guidance. Witnessing keeps you centered in your true identity regardless of circumstances. Together, these practices create a stable spiritual consciousness that can handle any life situation. Joel taught that this isn't about becoming perfect or eliminating all human challenges. It's about maintaining your connection to spiritual truth so that divine healing and demonstration can unfold through you naturally and consistently. You don't become superhuman. You become transparently human, allowing God to express through you. When these techniques become natural rather than forced, you discover what Joel called the mystical life, where God's grace becomes your daily experience rather than something you only hope for during desperate moments. Spiritual consciousness becomes your natural state rather than something you have to work to achieve. Many students encounter a common obstacle. Their prayers feel mechanical or empty. They're following the 60-second method but not experiencing the inner transformation that should accompany authentic spiritual practice. This happens for specific reasons Joel identified and addressed in his advanced teachings for students who had been practicing for several months. The most frequent cause is trying to use the technique to manipulate outcomes rather than genuinely recognizing spiritual truth. If you're secretly hoping your 60 seconds will fix your problems, you're still operating from human will rather than divine surrender. This subtle motive makes all the difference in the effectiveness of your practice. Joel taught that the purpose isn't to get God to do what you want. The purpose is to align with what God is already doing. When your motive shifts from manipulation to recognition, the practice becomes authentic and powerful. The difference is between using God and being used by God for divine purposes. The solution is examining your heart honestly. Are you trying to use God, or are you opening to be used by God? This subtle but crucial difference determines whether your practice leads to genuine transformation or becomes another form of human willpower disguised as spiritual practice. Another common challenge is mental resistance during the 60-second practice. Your mind fills with worries, doubts, or distracting thoughts just when you're trying to focus on God's presence. Joel understood this phenomenon and offered practical guidance based on his years of experience helping students overcome this natural but temporary obstacle. He taught that mental resistance is actually a sign that your consciousness is shifting from human thinking to spiritual awareness. The ego naturally resists this shift because it threatens the ego's sense of control and importance. Understanding this helps you not take the resistance personally or assume you're doing something wrong. Instead of fighting distracting thoughts, Joel suggested acknowledging them briefly and then returning attention to spiritual truth. Think of it like training a puppy. You gently redirect attention without anger or frustration when the mind wanders. Force and struggle only create more mental agitation and resistance. With consistent practice, the mental resistance decreases naturally. Your consciousness becomes accustomed to spiritual focus. What initially felt difficult becomes effortless as your awareness stabilizes in divine presence rather than human mental chatter. The mind learns to cooperate with your spiritual intention rather than fighting it. The third obstacle many students face is impatience with results. They practice the 60-second method for a few days or weeks and expect dramatic transformations. When changes don't happen immediately, they conclude the technique doesn't work and abandon the practice before it has time to build the necessary consciousness for demonstration. Joel emphasized that spiritual development follows natural laws just like physical growth. A seed doesn't become a tree overnight. Consciousness doesn't shift from years of human thinking to spiritual awareness without a natural unfolding process. Every moment of practice is building a foundation that will eventually manifest as improved conditions. He taught that every sincere moment of spiritual recognition is building a foundation of consciousness that will eventually manifest as improved health, relationships, supply, and overall life experience. Nothing is ever wasted in spiritual practice. Even when you don't see immediate results, transformation is happening at consciousness levels. The key is practicing for the joy of recognizing God's presence rather than practicing for results. When you find fulfillment in the spiritual connection itself, demonstration naturally follows as a byproduct of elevated consciousness. The practice becomes its own reward rather than a means to an end. Students sometimes worry they're not doing the technique correctly because their experience doesn't match others' stories. Joel taught that spiritual practice is deeply individual. Your relationship with God is unique and can't be compared to anyone else's experience. Divine consciousness expresses through each person according to their particular nature and circumstances. Some people experience immediate emotional relief. Others notice gradual changes in circumstances. Some feel deep peace during practice. Others experience insights and inspiration. All of these responses indicate that spiritual consciousness is awakening and working. There's no single correct way to experience the 60-second method. Joel's advice was simple. Trust the process and remain consistent regardless of how your individual experience unfolds. The divine intelligence that created you knows exactly how to work through your particular consciousness and circumstances. Your spiritual development will unfold in the way that's perfect for your unique spiritual journey. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment. Which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to integrate the 60-second method into challenging situations as they arise. When confronted with illness, lack, conflict, or any problem, they immediately shift into spiritual recognition rather than human reactive thinking. This becomes an automatic response that protects consciousness from being disturbed by appearances. Joel taught a businessman named David this advanced application. During a crucial negotiation that could save his company, David felt panic rising. Instead of succumbing to fear, he spent 60 seconds acknowledging divine wisdom and love as the substance of all true business relationships. This inner shift immediately affected the entire atmosphere. The shift in David's consciousness was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. His anxiety transformed into confidence. His desperation became clarity. The negotiation proceeded smoothly, and both parties found mutually beneficial solutions that exceeded everyone's expectations. David's spiritual consciousness had elevated the entire situation. David realized that the 60-second method wasn't just for quiet prayer time. It was a tool for maintaining spiritual consciousness during the exact moments when human thinking would typically create problems and limitation. This real-time application of Joel's teaching transformed his entire approach to business challenges. Advanced students also learn to apply Joel's method to other people's problems without interfering with their free will. When someone shares their troubles with you, instead of giving human advice or feeling emotionally disturbed, you silently recognize God's perfection operating in their experience. This is one of the most powerful forms of spiritual healing. Maria practiced this when her adult son struggled with addiction. Instead of constantly worrying and trying to control his choices, she would spend 60 seconds acknowledging divine love as his true identity, regardless of his current behavior or circumstances. This practice kept her peaceful while supporting his healing at the consciousness level. This practice kept Maria peaceful and centered while her son worked through his challenges. More importantly, her consciousness of his spiritual perfection seemed to support his eventual recovery in ways that her human worry and interference never could have accomplished. Her spiritual recognition created space for his own spiritual awakening. Joel taught that this silent recognition of others' divine nature is one of the most powerful forms of prayer. You're not trying to change anyone. You're simply holding them in the light of their spiritual truth. This consciousness of their perfection supports their own spiritual development without violating their free will or personal journey. Another advanced application involves using the 60-second method for global situations. When news reports or world events trigger fear and hopelessness, Joel taught students to respond from spiritual consciousness rather than human emotional reaction. This transforms you from part of the problem into part of the solution at the consciousness level. Instead of being overwhelmed by world problems, you spend 60 seconds recognizing divine love as the only true power operating in human affairs. You acknowledge God's wisdom working through all situations, even those that appear chaotic or destructive to human perception. This doesn't mean ignoring problems, but seeing them from spiritual perspective. This practice doesn't make you indifferent to human suffering. It connects you to the spiritual power that can actually help resolve problems rather than just adding more fear and negativity to collective human consciousness. Your consciousness of divine harmony contributes to the healing of global challenges. Students who consistently practice this approach report feeling more hopeful about world conditions and more inspired to take constructive action in their communities. They become part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Their spiritual consciousness radiates healing influence wherever they go. The most advanced application of Joel's method is living from continuous spiritual recognition. Instead of compartmentalizing prayer into specific times, your entire life becomes a recognition of God's presence expressing through every activity and relationship. This is what Joel called the mystical life, where everything becomes an expression of spiritual consciousness. This doesn't mean walking around in a spiritual trance or disconnecting from practical responsibilities. It means maintaining awareness that divine intelligence is operating through you as you handle work, relationships, finances, health, and all aspects of human experience. You remain fully engaged while spiritually centered. Joel lived this way during his later years. Students reported that being in his presence was healing because his consciousness was so consistently aligned with spiritual truth. He had become what he called a transparency for God. Divine love, wisdom, and healing power flowed through him naturally without human effort or manipulation. This level of development takes time and consistent practice, but it represents the ultimate goal of mystical Christianity that Joel pioneered. You become a clear channel for divine love, wisdom, and healing power in the world. Your very presence becomes a blessing to everyone you encounter throughout your daily activities. Your new understanding of prayer transforms everything about your spiritual life. You no longer approach God as a beggar hoping for divine favors. You recognize yourself as God's beloved expression, already complete and perfect in spiritual truth. This understanding eliminates the sense of separation and unworthiness that characterizes traditional religious approaches. This shift eliminates the anxiety and desperation that used to characterize your prayer life. Instead of worrying whether God will answer your prayers, you rest in the knowing that God's nature is already expressing as your true being. Prayer becomes communion rather than petition, recognition rather than request. Your 60-second practice becomes a joyful recognition rather than a desperate petition. You discover that communion with God is your natural state, not something you have to earn through perfect behavior or eloquent words. This understanding brings tremendous peace and confidence to your spiritual journey. This understanding ripples through every area of your life. Relationships improve because you're not trying to get love from others. Finances stabilize because you're not operating from consciousness of lack. Health improves because you're aligned with divine wholeness. Everything changes when your foundation shifts from human need to spiritual recognition. The transformation affects how you handle daily challenges. Instead of immediately reacting with fear, anger, or worry when problems appear, you automatically return to spiritual recognition. This response becomes as natural as breathing. You develop spiritual reflexes that protect your consciousness from being disturbed by appearances. Your family and friends notice changes in your energy and presence. You become more peaceful, confident, and loving without trying to be different. The spiritual consciousness you're cultivating naturally expresses as improved character and behavior. People are drawn to the peace and joy they sense in you. Work becomes an opportunity to express divine qualities, rather than just earning money. Relationships become chances to recognize God's love in others, rather than trying to get your needs met through human personality connections. Every interaction becomes an opportunity for spiritual recognition and expression. Every aspect of your life becomes infused with spiritual meaning and purpose. You're living from the inside out instead of being controlled by external circumstances and other people's opinions or behavior. Your spiritual center becomes unshakable regardless of what appears in your human experience. Joel's 60-second method has given you the key to mystical Christianity that transforms ordinary human existence into extraordinary spiritual expression. You've discovered that effective prayer is recognition, not petition, unity, not separation, being, not asking. This understanding revolutionizes your entire approach to spirituality and daily living. This isn't the end of your spiritual journey. It's the beginning of a deeper adventure into the infinite possibilities that unfold when human consciousness aligns with divine truth consistently and authentically. You now have practical tools that work in real-life situations rather than just theoretical spiritual knowledge. You now have practical tools for maintaining spiritual awareness regardless of what appears in your human experience. You can handle success and failure, health and illness, abundance and lack from the same centered place of divine recognition. Your spiritual foundation becomes unshakable. Most importantly, you've learned that God's grace isn't something you have to earn or deserve. It's something you simply recognize and allow to express through your willingness to see from spiritual perspective rather than human limitation. This understanding brings tremendous freedom and peace to your spiritual journey. Your prayer life will never be the same. You've moved beyond begging God for help to recognizing God as the very consciousness you express in every moment. This is the mystical Christianity that Joel Goldsmith pioneered and shared with thousands of students worldwide. You're now part of this lineage of spiritual understanding and practice. The 60-second method is simple, but its effects are profound and lasting. Continue practicing with consistency and sincerity. Trust the process even when results don't appear immediately. Divine consciousness is always working, even when human perception can't detect the changes happening at deeper levels of your being. Remember that you're not trying to get God to do something for you. You're allowing God to be what God already is through you. This understanding makes all the difference between prayer that works and prayer that feels empty and unanswered. You're now equipped with the understanding that transforms prayer from petition to recognition. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path. Most people live their entire lives trapped in what Joel Goldsmith called the material sense, a powerful illusion that makes you believe you are separate from the infinite source of all good. This illusion creates every problem you face: lack, disease, conflict, and fear that seems so real. But here is the liberating truth Goldsmith discovered through decades of spiritual healing work. You are not a material being having occasional spiritual experiences. You are pure consciousness itself, temporarily appearing in human form, with unlimited access to divine supply and healing power. The moment you truly grasp this fundamental shift in identity, everything changes. Your problems don't get solved, they dissolve because you realize they were never real in the first place. You stop trying to heal your body and instead recognize your spiritual perfection that was always there. This is not positive thinking or mental tricks. This is the recognition of what you have always been, the very presence of God expressing as your individual being. When you live from this truth, miracles become your natural experience because you are no longer fighting illusions. Joel Goldsmith taught that every human problem stems from one fundamental error, believing that you exist separate from your source. This belief creates what he called the pairs of opposites, good and evil, health and sickness, abundance and lack, that keep you trapped in endless cycles. When you accept that there is only one power and one presence in the universe, these opposites dissolve. There is no evil power to fight, no sickness to heal, no lack to overcome. There is only infinite good expressing itself perfectly as your life, right here and right now. The practical application begins with what Goldsmith called the practice of the presence. Instead of trying to get something from God, you recognize that you already are the fullness of God in expression. Every breath you take is God breathing. Every thought is divine intelligence flowing. Start right now by stopping all mental effort to change your circumstances. Rest in the knowing that perfection is already established. Feel the presence that you are, not the presence you hope to find. This shift from seeking to being is where true transformation begins. Goldsmith discovered that most spiritual seekers make a critical mistake. They try to use truth to improve their human experience, when truth reveals there never was a human experience to improve. You are not a person who can become more spiritual. You are spirit appearing as a person. This understanding transforms prayer completely. Instead of asking God to change your conditions, you recognize that God is your very consciousness, and your consciousness is already perfect, whole, and complete. Prayer becomes a recognition of what already is, not a request for what might be. The healing work that made Goldsmith famous worldwide was based on this principle. He never tried to heal anyone. Instead, he recognized the spiritual perfection of every person who came to him, and this recognition dissolved the illusion of imperfection that seemed to appear as their problem. You have this same power of recognition available to you right now. Look at any challenge in your life and ask, what would be true if I were pure consciousness having this experience? The answer will reveal the illusion and allow the truth to appear naturally. The deepest teaching Goldsmith shared was this: you cannot demonstrate truth. You can only be truth. Every attempt to use spiritual principles to get something keeps you trapped in the very illusion you are trying to escape. Truth is not a tool you use. Truth is what you are. This means that abundance is not something you attract or manifest. Abundance is the very nature of the infinite consciousness that you are. Health is not something you heal into. Health is the unchanging reality of your spiritual being that cannot be touched by material conditions. When you stop trying to demonstrate and simply rest in being, what the world calls miracles begin to appear naturally. Not because you made them happen, but because you stopped interfering with the perfection that was always flowing as your life experience. The invitation Goldsmith offers is radical. Stop being a human trying to be spiritual, and start being the spiritual being you have always been, appearing temporarily as human. This is not a process. This is a recognition that changes everything in an instant. A businessman came to Goldsmith facing bankruptcy, desperately seeking a spiritual solution to save his failing company. For weeks he practiced affirmations and visualizations, trying to demonstrate prosperity. but his situation only worsened. His frustration was overwhelming. Goldsmith told him something unexpected. Stop trying to make your business successful. Stop trying to be prosperous. Instead, recognize that infinite intelligence is the only power operating your consciousness, and infinite intelligence cannot fail. The man was confused but willing to try this different approach. Within 3 days of releasing all personal effort and resting in the presence of divine intelligence as his true identity, breakthrough solutions began appearing, not through his planning, but through inspiration and opportunities that seemed to arise from nowhere. Within 6 months, his business had not only recovered, but had expanded beyond his original dreams. He realized that trying to demonstrate prosperity had actually blocked the natural flow of abundance that was always available through his divine nature. A mother brought her chronically ill child to Goldsmith after years of medical treatments had failed to help. She was exhausted from trying every healing modality, both conventional and alternative, watching her daughter suffer despite all their efforts to make her well. Goldsmith spent no time discussing the child's symptoms or medical history. Instead, he helped the mother see that her daughter was not a sick child who needed healing. She was the perfect expression of divine life, temporarily appearing to experience illness as part of her spiritual journey. As the mother released her identity as someone with a sick child and embraced the truth of her daughter's spiritual perfection, something shifted in their entire family dynamic. The desperate energy of trying to fix something wrong was replaced by peaceful recognition of what was right. Over the following weeks, the child's health began improving naturally, not through any specific treatment, but through the dissolution of the mental atmosphere of illness that had surrounded their home. The healing came through recognition, not through effort. A couple on the verge of divorce sought Goldsmith's guidance, convinced their marriage was beyond repair. Years of conflict, betrayal, and resentment had created what seemed like an insurmountable barrier between them. Traditional counseling had only made them more aware of their differences. Goldsmith surprised them by saying, "There are not two people in conflict here. There is only one consciousness appearing as two individuals, and that consciousness is love itself. The conflict you experience is the illusion of separation from your true nature and from each other." He taught them to see beyond their personality differences and recognize the divine presence that was the true identity of both of them. When they stopped trying to change each other and started recognizing the spiritual perfection already present, their relationship began transforming naturally. Within months, they discovered a depth of love and understanding they had never experienced before. Their marriage became not just restored, but transformed into a spiritual partnership that supported both of their individual growth and their shared service to others. A war veteran struggling with severe trauma and nightmares came to Goldsmith feeling hopeless about ever finding peace. Years of therapy and medication had provided little relief, and he was beginning to believe he was permanently damaged by his experiences overseas. Goldsmith helped him understand that his true identity as spiritual consciousness could never be damaged by any experience, no matter how traumatic. The memories and emotional reactions were real on the human level, but they had no power over his spiritual nature, which remained perfect and untouchable. Through daily practice of recognizing himself as consciousness rather than as a traumatized veteran, he began experiencing moments of profound peace that gradually extended into hours and then days. The nightmares didn't stop through fighting them. They dissolved through recognition of his undisturbed spiritual reality. After a year of this practice, he had not only found personal peace, but had begun helping other veterans discover the same spiritual foundation for healing. His transformation became a source of hope and healing for many others who had lost faith in recovery. If these transformation stories inspire you, like this video to help others find these teachings, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. What healing journey resonated most with you? Beyond the fundamental recognition of your spiritual identity, Goldsmith taught specific practices to deepen your experience of truth. The first is what he called beholding, learning to look at every person, situation, and condition through spiritual eyes rather than material judgment. When you behold someone, you see past their human appearance to recognize the divine presence that they are. This is not pretending that problems don't exist. It's seeing through the problem to the spiritual reality that remains unchanged regardless of appearances. Practice this now with someone in your life who challenges you. Instead of seeing their personality, behavior, or problems, quietly recognize the Christ consciousness is the only presence here. Perfection is the only reality expressing as this person. Notice how this shifts your entire experience of them. This practice of beholding dissolves the sense of otherness that creates all relationship conflicts. When you consistently see people as they truly are spiritually, they begin responding from their highest nature because you are no longer holding them in the prison of limited human expectations. The second complementary practice Goldsmith taught is listening within, developing the ability to receive divine guidance directly rather than relying solely on human reasoning and planning. This inner listening is not meditation in the traditional sense, but receptive awareness to spiritual inspiration. Begin each day by taking time to be still and receptive, asking, "What would love have me know today?" Don't try to hear specific answers. Instead, develop sensitivity to the gentle impulses, ideas, and feelings that arise from your deeper spiritual nature. As you practice this listening, you'll discover that divine intelligence is always seeking to express through you as perfect action, right decisions, and loving responses. You don't have to figure out your life. You only need to be receptive to the guidance that is always flowing. This practice transforms decision-making from struggle into grace. Instead of weighing pros and cons with your human mind, you learn to feel your way into alignment with the divine will that already knows the perfect outcome for every situation. The third practice is releasing into the invisible, learning to let go of your human attempts to control outcomes and trust the spiritual forces that are always working on your behalf. This requires developing faith in what cannot be seen, but can always be felt. When facing any challenge, instead of immediately trying to solve it with human effort, first take time to release the situation completely into the care of divine intelligence. Say, "I don't know how this will resolve, but I trust the spiritual law to bring perfect harmony." This release is not passive resignation, it's active cooperation with spiritual power. As you let go of your limited human solutions, you create space for divine solutions that are beyond anything your personal mind could have conceived or accomplished. Many students struggle with this practice because it seems like giving up, but releasing into the invisible is actually the highest form of spiritual action. You are aligning your individual will with the universal will that already knows the perfect outcome. The final complementary practice is living from grace, recognizing that your good comes not from your efforts, but from the inexhaustible source within you that gives freely without your having to earn or deserve it. This transforms your relationship with both giving and receiving. Grace means that your supply is not dependent on your job, your efforts, or economic conditions. Your supply flows from the infinite storehouse of consciousness itself, which can never be depleted and has no external limitations or restrictions. Practice giving without expectation of return, knowing that your generosity opens channels for grace to flow more freely through your experience. When you give from the understanding that you are the outlet of infinite supply, giving becomes joy rather than sacrifice. Simultaneously, learn to receive gracefully without guilt, or the need to reciprocate immediately. When you understand that all good flows from the one source, receiving someone's kindness is simply accepting another form of divine grace expressing through human channels. The most common obstacle students encounter is the tendency to evaluate their spiritual progress by their human circumstances. When conditions don't improve quickly, they assume the principles aren't working and return to human efforts to control their experience. Goldsmith taught that spiritual progress is often invisible to the human sense. Your consciousness may be transforming profoundly, while your external circumstances temporarily remain unchanged. The real work is happening in your recognition and awareness, not necessarily in your material conditions. Instead of measuring success by what appears in your world, measure it by your inner sense of peace, your freedom from fear, and your growing ability to see through appearances to spiritual reality. These inner changes are the true indicators of spiritual growth. Trust the process even when you cannot see immediate results. Often the greatest transformations happen quietly over time as your new spiritual understanding gradually dissolves old patterns and creates space for entirely new experiences to emerge naturally. Another significant challenge is the temptation to use these spiritual principles to fix specific problems, rather than allowing them to transform your entire foundation of understanding. This approach keeps you trapped in the illusion that there are problems to solve. When you focus on demonstrating health, prosperity, or harmony, you're actually affirming the reality of disease, lack, and discord. True spiritual healing recognizes that these opposite conditions never had any real existence. They were only appearances in consciousness. The correct approach is to recognize perfection as the only reality and allow that recognition to naturally dissolve whatever seems to contradict it. You're not healing anything. You're recognizing what was never truly ill or broken. This shift requires patience and persistence because the human mind wants to see immediate changes in conditions. But as you consistently rest in truth rather than trying to demonstrate it, the appearances naturally align with your spiritual understanding. Many students also struggle with guilt about their human experiences, believing they should be beyond certain emotions, desires, or reactions if they truly understand spiritual truth. This judgment actually creates more separation from their spiritual nature. Goldsmith taught that being human while recognizing your spiritual identity is not a contradiction. It's the very purpose of your existence. You are consciousness experiencing itself through human form, and this includes the full range of human feelings and experiences. The goal is not to eliminate your humanity, but to hold it lightly, recognizing that your human experiences are temporary expressions of consciousness rather than your permanent identity. You can feel anger, sadness, or fear without believing these emotions define who you are. Compassion toward your human experience creates the inner space for your spiritual nature to express more freely. When you stop judging your humanness, you naturally begin expressing more of your divine qualities without effort or strain. The deepest challenge students face is the fear that if they truly let go of human effort and control, nothing good will happen in their lives. This fear keeps them oscillating between spiritual practice and human manipulation, preventing full transformation. This fear is actually the ego's last defense against the recognition of your true nature. The ego believes it is responsible for your survival and success, so releasing control feels like death to the separate sense of self that has run your life. The truth is that when you release human effort, you don't become passive. You become receptive to divine action that is far more intelligent and powerful than anything your personal mind could orchestrate. You trade limited human solutions for unlimited spiritual possibilities. Take the step of complete release in one area of your life as an experiment. Choose something you've been struggling to control and surrender it entirely to spiritual law. Watch how divine intelligence begins operating when you stop interfering with its perfect action. If these challenge-breaking techniques speak to your heart, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced spiritual practices, and comment, which obstacle are you ready to transform now? Advanced practitioners learn to live in what Goldsmith called the atmosphere of God, a state of consciousness where spiritual awareness becomes so natural that it requires no effort to maintain. This is consciousness living as consciousness, rather than a person trying to be spiritual. In this atmosphere, you respond to every situation from spiritual understanding, rather than human reaction. When someone is hostile, you see their underlying spiritual perfection. When lack appears, you recognize abundance as the only reality. When disease manifests, you know health as the unchanging truth. This doesn't mean you become detached or uncaring about human experiences. Instead, you become more loving and effective because you're operating from the source of all wisdom and compassion rather than from personal opinions and emotional reactions. Living in this atmosphere transforms not only your personal experience, but influences everyone around you. People feel peaceful in your presence because you are no longer projecting the conflicts and fears that most humans carry unconsciously. The integration of these principles into daily work and relationships requires what Goldsmith called practicing the presence throughout ordinary activities. This means recognizing that consciousness is the only activity taking place, whether you're cooking dinner, attending meetings, or raising children. When you approach work from this understanding, your job becomes a spiritual practice rather than just a means of earning money. Every task becomes an opportunity for consciousness to express its intelligence, creativity, and love, through the form of your individual life. Relationships transform when you consistently see the people in your life as consciousness, appearing in different forms, rather than as separate individuals with conflicting needs and desires. Conflicts resolve naturally when you refuse to accept the illusion of separation. Even mundane activities like cleaning house or paying bills become expressions of divine order when you recognize that consciousness is the only presence performing these activities. Nothing is separate from your spiritual nature. Everything becomes sacred. Advanced students often face the challenge of living these principles while dealing with family members or colleagues who operate purely from material sense. You cannot force others to see spiritually, but you can maintain your own spiritual perspective regardless of their level of understanding. The key is to never defend or argue about spiritual principles. Live from them quietly, and let your peace and effectiveness speak for itself. When others see the fruits of consciousness in your life, some will naturally become curious about your inner foundation. For those who remain resistant or critical of your spiritual approach, recognize that their opposition is not personal. It's the material sense defending itself against the recognition of truth. Respond with compassion rather than attempting to convince them intellectually. Your consistent demonstration of spiritual principles in practical daily life becomes a silent blessing to everyone around you. You are establishing an atmosphere of truth that influences others, even when they are not consciously aware of it. The ultimate integration happens when the line between spiritual practice and ordinary living disappears completely. You no longer have times when you remember to be spiritual and times when you forget. Consciousness becomes your permanent resting place. At this level, challenges still appear in human experience, but they no longer disturb your inner equilibrium. You handle difficulties from spiritual understanding rather than human frustration, which often resolves situations more quickly and harmoniously than reactive responses. You stop seeking spiritual experiences and start recognizing that every moment is already spiritual. Whether you're experiencing joy or difficulty, success or apparent failure, you maintain awareness that consciousness is the only reality expressing as all these temporary appearances. This integration is not a destination you reach, but a deepening recognition that continues expanding throughout your lifetime. Each day offers new opportunities to live more consistently from your spiritual understanding rather than from human appearance. The complete transformation Goldsmith pointed toward is the recognition that you have never been separate from your source for even one moment. All the years of seeking, struggling, and trying to become more spiritual were based on the false premise that you were not already whole. This recognition doesn't make you perfect in human terms. It reveals the perfection that has always been your true nature, temporarily expressing through human experience. Your problems were never really problems. They were opportunities for consciousness to know itself more completely. When this understanding becomes living reality rather than intellectual concept, fear dissolves permanently. Not because your circumstances become perfect, but because you recognize that your true self can never be threatened by any external condition or change. You discover that everything you thought you needed to accomplish or achieve was actually already accomplished in consciousness. Your only work is to recognize what is already perfect and allow that perfection to express itself naturally through your human experience. From this transformed perspective, you realize that your entire spiritual journey has been consciousness awakening to itself through the vehicle of your individual awareness. Every challenge, every breakthrough, every moment of confusion or clarity has been part of this awakening process. You understand now that you were never a separate person trying to find God. You have always been God expressing as an individual person, temporarily forgetting and then remembering your true nature. The seeker and the sought were never two different things. This recognition brings profound gratitude for every experience you've had, including the difficult ones, because you see how each experience contributed to the awakening of consciousness within your awareness. Nothing was wasted. Everything served the ultimate purpose. You no longer feel the need to prove or defend your spiritual understanding because you know it as living reality rather than belief system. Your life becomes a natural expression of consciousness, knowing itself as your individual being. The practical result of this transformation is that you become a beneficial presence wherever you go, not through trying to help or heal others, but simply through being consciousness awake to itself, which automatically blesses everyone who comes into contact with your atmosphere. You stop having a personal agenda about how your life should unfold and instead become receptive to how consciousness wants to express through your unique individuality. This creates a life of constant surprise and delight as new possibilities appear naturally. Problems don't disappear from human experience, but your relationship to them transforms completely. Instead of obstacles to overcome, they become opportunities for consciousness to reveal new aspects of its infinite nature through your individual awareness. You discover that true service to others happens not through doing specific things, but through maintaining your recognition of spiritual truth, which creates an atmosphere where others can more easily recognize their own spiritual nature. The ultimate secret Joel Goldsmith revealed is this: you are not a human being on a spiritual journey. You are consciousness itself, temporarily appearing as a human being for the joy of experiencing its own infinite nature through individual awareness and expression. This means that every moment of your existence, whether pleasant or challenging, is consciousness celebrating its own aliveness through the unique perspective of your individual being. You are literally God's way of experiencing what it's like to be you. When this becomes your living understanding rather than just a beautiful idea, your entire relationship to existence transforms. Fear becomes impossible because you recognize there is nothing separate from you that could threaten you. Love becomes natural because you see yourself in everyone and everything. You realize that awakening was never about becoming something different. It was about recognizing what you have always been. The journey ends where it began, but now you know yourself as consciousness rather than as a seeker. You are home, and you have never left. If your spiritual understanding expanded through these Joel Goldsmith secrets, like this video, subscribe for more transformative teachings, and comment, "I am transformed," to confirm your new path.